And the reason we picked this topic this time is, as you all know, Agile software development and Agile in general has been well over 10-year-old. Manifesto was signed in 2001, so technically 13-year-old officially Agile practice. But still, even though there's a widespread adoption of Agile and it's fairly mature in many companies, we still find that many companies have challenges around adoption of Agile, and we thought this was the case study and the experience that we'll have Jim Smith share from his company, PDX example, is a great one to share as a series of lessons learned from adoption of Agile, which many of them you're going to find will resonate with many of you. So that's the topic today. And it, in this situation, covers a lot of usual complexities of distributed development and so on that we'll cover. So these are all excellent lessons, and I'm glad to have that covered today. By way of logistics, we'll have about 45 minutes or so of presentation, and we'll take some questions along the way as they make sense. But we'll still reserve another 10-15 minutes towards the end for taking general questions. So you guys keep thinking about your questions, about challenges you see and what you want to ask, and keep sending them into the Q&A panel here, and I'll monitor the questions, and I'll inject some questions along the way, and then others will take at the end. We may not be able to cover all the questions, but we'll try our best. With that, let me introduce our speaker, and also we will make a recorded version of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint of the document available through our website in a couple of days after the webinar. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, Jim Smith. Jim is Senior Vice President of Innovation and Trends at PDX. PDX is a retail pharmacy software company, 25-plus-year-old company, very successful, probably #1 player in their market category. And Jim, for 11 years, was overseeing software development teams at PDX and various sizes and shapes of these teams before he decided to jump onto Agile way of doing product development for all of his 4 product lines, which was around 250 development people at PDX. So Jim was introduced to PDX to introduce PDX to Scrum, a form of variation of Agile, just about 10 years ago now. So he will share his perspective, and I'll let Jim provide more color on PDX and his kind of a specific role at PDX. So with that, over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Hemant. I'll get started now. So first I want to tell you a little bit about myself, just a tiny bit. First of all, I'm not a consultant. Hemant just mentioned that I've been at PDX for a while. I've been there for 22 years. I hope to retire there someday. Not that there's anything wrong with being a consultant or anything like that, but oftentimes I detect when I give this talk to various companies that they think that I'm going to come in and try and shake things up and try and change the way they do things, and that's not the case. Basically, we just like to share information about that we think is going to be useful to the community, and so that's really the whole purpose of this thing. I'm a developer by trade. I'm a Java developer. I still like to write some Java code, but I've been in management for the past 13 years. This says 11 years. We created this presentation about 2 years ago. We didn't really have the need to update it much. It already has quite a few lessons in it, and it would be a little bit of a challenge to get them all in within 45 minutes. We're going to run through this thing. The format for this presentation is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go through a list of various miscellaneous lessons that we've learned at PDX in our implementation of Agile. One thing that's interesting is that we're still learning. Even though I handed the rest of software development over to one of my peers 2 years ago, Todd Crossland with PDX, we're still learning. We're still making changes to the process. It's something that never ends. But at the time, 2 years ago, I oversaw the development of 4 pretty complex product lines, retail pharmacy software product lines, and that included about 250 programmers, QA testers, software architects, and database administrators. What we call our design team, which is a set of basically business analysts that also design the software. They do more than just plain old business analysts do, but that team reported to another vice president at PDX.
So Jim, in case you're advancing the pages, I just want to make sure we are keeping up with the with the pages. We are still on the front cover page of your.
You are. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on. I've moved on to the one that says disclaimer at the top.
Okay. Okay. All right. So maybe my machine is taking. Okay. So it's not refreshing yet. Maybe just go back into it and do it again. Might
Okay.
help.
Do you have to, make me the presenter? Oh, I think I know what I did wrong there.
Okay.
How about now? Does it say disclaimer?
Yeah. Now it says. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, a little bit of context before we get into the individual lessons, too. I want to tell you a little bit about PDX Incorporated. We are, as Hemant said, the leaders in the retail pharmacy software industry. So, some of our customers include Target, Safeway, Albertsons, Kaiser Permanente. We've got a bunch of big retail pharmacy chains as customers, in addition to a pretty large number of independent pharmacies. Something that a lot of people don't realize is retail pharmacy is extremely complex. In addition to managing workflow within a pharmacy, our system also does pricing on prescriptions, and the pricing schemes are very complex. It manages drug inventory. It does clinical checking on prescriptions, which itself is a very complex piece. It manages online adjudication with insurance companies, and then the processing of the responses. And then it interfaces with lots of other different systems, including point-of-sale systems, IVR systems, robotic pharmacy systems, and so on. Lots of different systems. And the landscape is constantly changing. Our customers are always probing, looking for new ways to get revenue at the pharmacy as their margins shrink in time. And so what we had going on about 10 years ago was actually a little longer than 10 years ago. We had a legacy system that had been around for about 20-something years, and it was an old text-based system. In fact, it's still in production. It's in place in thousands of pharmacies, but we knew even 12 to 15 years ago that we needed to replace it. We needed to update it with new technology. And so we embarked on a new project we called the Enterprise Pharmacy System, or EPS. So just to give you a quick idea about where we were, I had experience at the point that I took over that team as a software development manager. I had about 5 developers working on my team, and I managed them really well, I thought. I ran a very tight ship. I knew what every single one of those guys were working on at any given moment. All communication funneled through me, the manager of that team. So they didn't really have to talk to anybody outside the team, not much. And no one outside the team really needed to speak to them. All communication came through me. We delivered the software when it was ready, and it all seemed to work well enough. However, once we started on the enterprise pharmacy system, building a brand new pharmacy system from scratch, it was that the old techniques stopped working. For several months, we spun our tires as we tried to get this pharmacy system off the ground. All of our traditional techniques weren't working when we had dozens of programmers and QA testers working on the project. We knew we had to resort to something different. So a developer came to me one day and said, hey, he knew that we were very stressed out because we hadn't made a lot of progress yet. We certainly didn't have anything we could show to anybody to inspire confidence outside of our group. And he said, hey, I heard about this thing called Scrum. Maybe we ought to look into it. I think it would work really well with our company. And I said, yeah, whatever. I don't have time for this, really. But then he really pressed the issue, and I started to listen, and eventually I said, you know what, that might work, but I don't think we're going to call it Scrum. That sounds too gimmicky. We'll just start developing software this other way. So we spoke to a lot of other folks on the team, a lot of the other stakeholders, and they started to buy in, some of them more reluctantly than others. But then once we got things going, it was, to me, kind of like what seeing the pyramids is for a lot of people, or seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. It blows your mind completely. There were a lot of things that started to happen once we made the switch to Agile development that had never happened before. And it really was, truly, for me, amazing. So let's get into, and some of the things we saw, I'll talk about them in these lessons learned, but one of them that really amazed me was how the amount of motivation I started seeing coming out of developers. When I say developers, I don't just mean programmers. I mean quality assurance testers, QA testers, and design folks too, and others. But it really blew my mind how those folks their motivation levels just went through the roof. And I had to in the past, I no longer had to ask people to work overtime. They just worked overtime they needed to, and if they didn't need to work overtime, they didn't. Getting the opportunity to select what they were going to work on and then to commit to what they were going to work on. Having good folks, when you've got great folks, they want to meet their commitments, and so they do everything they can to meet them. So there were a lot of really amazing things going on when we adopted Agile development, when we started doing Scrum. So at the same time, we experienced great success. By the way, it wasn't just within the team, it was also outside the team. We started building confidence not only within our internal business stakeholders, but also with our customers. They started seeing real progress. We were able to demonstrate the software at the end of every iteration, and it really built their confidence quite a bit. So even though it was wonderful, we did learn a lot of lessons along the way, and we're continuing, as I said, to learn lessons. And so I'm going to jump through a whole bunch of those lessons in no particular order. So let's jump right into them. Lesson number one, everybody thinks that they're already Agile. In fact, I can remember at the time that we decided we were going to do Scrum, one of the reasons we decided it was okay was because we felt we were already doing a lot of the things that Scrum dictated we really ought to do, that the approach dictated we ought to do. For example, we really thought that we were doing a great job of collaborating. We never wanted to imagine that we had developers in separate silos working on separate things, okay? But we really were. And that's something you tend to run into when you're adopting Agile. You're going to run into some folks that say, oh, we already do Agile. But there are some important distinctions that if they're not doing them, then you're not really doing Agile. For example, if development managers are still handing out tasks to developers, that's not Agile. If you've got people basically saying, hey, we have iterations of development and they last 2 months, and when we get to the end of a sprint, an iteration of development, if the work's not done, well, then it's not done, and we just kind of take a deep breath and try and work it into the next iteration. That's not really very Agile either. Okay, but that's one thing we learned. One of the forms of resistance you run into in adopting Agile is individuals' beliefs that they're already Agile. Let's move on to lesson number two. Enabling developers to commit has spectacularly good effects. So, as I was saying earlier, when you tell a developer you're going to select what you're going to work on, I'm not just talking about programmers, I'm talking about QA testers and so on, they own it, and they manage their own overtime. They drive their teammates. They escalate. So they own it. That means that they take more of an interest in writing the code. They don't just code to the specifications. They start getting involved. Those walls between silos start coming down because they really feel as though they own it. And when you feel that you own it, you really want it to be something good. And so that was one of the seeing the pyramids moments for me, is seeing when, and it seems like a no-brainer, but a lot of development organizations don't do it. And I have to confess, we weren't really doing that before we started adopting Agile fully. Giving them that ownership has great effects. Another one that's I mentioned already is that they manage their own overtime. So gone are the days that you have to say, hey, guess what, guys? We're going to have to work late tonight to get, get the release out. You're going to see the team doing it themselves. They drive teammates. They drive each other. There's nothing worse when you're trying to meet a deadline than when you've got a member of your team that's not also trying to meet the deadline. And so you'd be amazed at how developers will start to drive their own teammates. This, as you can see, we're moving towards, when you adopt Agile, the team running itself and the manager having to do less driving. We'll talk more in a minute about how the manager gets other opportunities to do great other things when the team is running itself. Another something the team does is they escalate. When they're trying to meet the deadline, when they're trying to complete the iteration, complete all the work that they committed by the end of the iteration, then you're going to see them starting to escalate right away. They're not going to sit around and say, well, I hope that problem takes care of itself. They're going to bring to your attention more rapidly the things that are standing in the way of them getting the job done. These are all some of the great effects that giving developers the opportunity to commit has on your team. Lesson three, managers get to do good things. So I've heard development managers as they're embracing or as they're adopting Agile, I've heard some of them express, and I'm not just talking one or two, I'm talking about many of them, including me, express the concern that, hey, once the team starts running itself, what am I going to do? And the answer is there's still plenty to do. In fact, it frees you up as a manager to do so many other great things that really ought to be happening on a team that don't happen on teams often enough. One of them is coaching and mentoring. You get the opportunity to take all your years of experience as a software developer or as a manager and to use it to coach some of the folks that are coming up in your organization that are working their way up the ladder. You get the opportunity to mentor them and to coach them. It gives you the opportunity to make strategic organizational infrastructure enhancements and fixes. Like, let's say, for example, you want to switch from one bug tracking system to another, but maybe in your previous life, before Agile, you didn't have time to do it. There's just too much to do. We're working on getting that release out the door. Well, when the team is running itself, you get the time to do all those things that really should be happening for your team. Sort of your team's infrastructure technical debt. You're knocking that out. You're getting the opportunity to address it. You get the chance to audit. You get the chance to dig down and look at what your team is up to, making sure that they're doing the right thing, they're abiding by best practices. You're able to get and stay plugged into business. I can't tell you how many development managers I've seen that are completely decoupled from the business folks that they're serving. And oftentimes the reason is I simply don't have time to engage with them. I don't have time to talk to them. When you're doing Agile, not only do you have the time to engage with them, but it's something you really have an interest in doing in order to make the product as good as possible. It also gives you the opportunity to keep your foot soldiers educated. Again, something that I've seen in a lot of development organizations is that the development manager is leading a form of complacence. They are, basically not driving their team to stay current on technology. When the team running itself, you can take it upon yourself as the development manager to ensure that developers, your technologists in general, are getting regular doses of update information on what's going on out there in the industry. Java 8 is now in GA, for example. If you have a team of Java developers, are they up on what Java 8 is all about, on the features that it has, and so on? You get the opportunity to do this sort of thing when you're doing Agile. You're able to give morale the maintenance and care and feeding that it deserves. A lot of development managers, I've seen them do this sort of thing. They're not able to address morale problems because they're too busy trying to get software knocked out the door. And then finally, you're able to talk to other people. You're able to actually engage with some of your peers to find out what's going on with those other teams so that you don't duplicate effort or so that you don't reinvent the wheel. And also, it gives you the opportunity to coordinate. So talking to each other is another one of the benefits of Agile. Managers get to do that with each other, whereas previously, in a lot of cases, they simply don't have time, is the claim that they've got.
Jim, can we take one question while you're on
Sure.
this lesson? So, did you guys do any education or formal training on Agile practices or Agile overview for managers and executives before you started?
That's a great question. Initially, we did not. We basically read some articles on how to do Scrum, and we said, okay, let's just have a meeting and we'll explain this to everybody, how it's going to work. We did that. We answered a whole bunch of follow-up questions. We made adjustments along the way with that first sprint. But one thing I really wish that we had done, that we did about a year and a half, 2 years after we started doing this, is that we got some help from outside. We had someone come in and give managers and individual foot soldiers training on Scrum, what it's supposed to be all about. I remember that guy came in and wanted to know a little bit about our how we do things at PDX, and I said, I'd rather not tell you that. I don't want to poison the well. I want you to just come in and tell us about how you do Scrum, and not necessarily how you do Scrum, but just tell us what Scrum is, what it's all about. And so he did that, and that helped to fill in a lot of cracks, and it helped us to correct a lot of bad things that we were doing.
So as a recommendation to our audience here, would you suggest that if they are struggling or trying to adopt Agile, to do upfront education or some sort of overview for executives and managers?
I would recommend that because it's highly available out there. When we were doing this, it was kind of a little known thing. You could mention the word Scrum or Agile to a lot of development managers and they didn't know what you were talking about, or it was just a nebulous idea to them. But these days, those guys are everywhere. They're, Agile coaches are very available. You can hire someone to come in. However, I do want to say that in some organizations I've seen, there's just a natural suspicion associated with bringing someone in from the outside. The usual issues, like they don't understand our business, they don't know how we do things, we're special, and so on. And so if you're in that kind of situation, I recommend that you just read some articles, because again, articles are plenty out there, and you try and do it on your own. And then if you struggle for a little bit, bring in someone from the outside. I do recommend you bring in someone from the outside regardless, but some organizations might not be able to do that because of the constraint I just mentioned.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, lesson number 4, write good user stories. So good user stories are a great thing. If you don't know, a user story is basically just a single sentence that encapsulates a requirement in Agile. An example might be, as a pharmacist, I need to be able to document the reasons I'm overriding a clinical check in order to create a complete clinical audit trail. Good user stories are a great thing. They tell a story in just one sentence. And when you get good at writing them, they don't take very long to create. We ran into some resistance within our organization when we first decided to start writing user stories. The claim was, once again, we're not going to have time to write those things. But we pushed, and eventually our team started writing them, and now we do it all the time. It's just a given that everything basically revolves around user stories. But you have to be careful. Sometimes user stories encapsulate not just requirements, but design. Sometimes you'll see someone writing a user story that says something along the lines of, as a pharmacist, I need a button that does blah, blah, blah. You don't really need a button. What you really need is to fulfill a given business requirement. It doesn't matter whether it's a button or a radio button or a text field or a checkbox or whatever. It is going to depend on the design of the application once you get there. But there's no need to incorporate that. In fact, you should not incorporate that into the user story. Another great thing about great user stories is that they make everybody understand the big picture. They're another great tool for eroding those walls, those silo walls between teams. Individual programmers, QA testers that are not, on the front lines with the business, they start to understand why you really need this piece of functionality. They start understanding the big picture, and that just produces great things, great software. One litmus test that I think is useful for testing a user story to see if it's a good one is what I call the no system litmus test. You just ask yourself the question, what if there were no software? For example, in a pharmacy, there was a time when there was no software. There were no computers in pharmacies. They used typewriters, and they wrote things out on paper. Well, at that time, the user story that I just mentioned, it still had applicability. Even in the pharmacy of 1950, there was still a need for a pharmacist to override any clinical checks that popped up in his own brain in order to create a complete clinical audit trail. So if you find yourself needing really to understand the whole system, to understand a user story, then that's usually a bad sign. But anyway, you could easily go on for a day or two talking about user stories, so that's just one little lesson. Good user stories are a great thing. Lesson 5, the industry feels that pre-planning is necessary. If you go back to 10 years ago and talked about Agile development, part of the whole Agile development was basically death to waterfall development. If you find yourself doing anything up front, that's usually a bad sign. That's not Agile. That was the belief 10 years ago in the industry. And if you show up for a kickoff meeting and you've got everything already figured out, then you're not getting the job done properly because you're not giving everybody the opportunity to weigh in on the design, or to not just to weigh in, but to actually help with the design of the software. Well, just in practice, it seems that the industry now believes that pre-planning is a fundamental part of the process. And I have to say, even at PDX, we do pre-planning these days, and that basically just means that before a kickoff meeting happens, we've already figured out a lot of things. It makes the kickoff meeting go more smoothly. Now, as far as my personal editorial goes on that, I would say that I probably agree with a lot of the folks that say that it's not really necessary, but that's assuming that everyone on your team is 100% agile-minded and that they're capable of diving in altogether to help design the software. In a lot of cases, this is not possible, just because the software may have such a specialized use that you do have to have someone with more knowledge and experience about the product figuring some things out before the kickoff meeting happens. This is kind of the consensus of the industry, even though I personally don't completely agree with it. Lesson 6, TDD is a way of life. For those of you that don't recognize that abbreviation, TDD, it stands for test-driven development. And it basically, I'm not going to try and explain all of test-driven development in this webinar. I recommend that you Google it if you don't know what it means. But it's really a very important part of Agile development. As I mentioned, way back in the day when I was managing a team of 5 developers, the software was ready for delivery. We delivered it when it was ready, once we had tested the heck out of it and verified that all the bugs were gone. But with Agile, you can't do that so easily. You've got to declare that you're going to be done on a given day. The sprint is going to end whether you like it or not on a particular day. And so to ensure that you've got good quality, you've got to do test-driven development. You've got to make sure you write your unit tests up front. So again, I'm not going to get into what TDD is all about, but I do have to say that we learned that it has to be an integral part of how you do development. You've got to adopt it wholeheartedly, or else you're not going to see good quality, or you're going to have to extend. You're going to have to say, well, our sprint is done, but we're going to need another 3 or 4 months for this thing to bake as we repeatedly fix bugs and regression test, fix bugs, regression test, and so on.
Jim, let me take one quick question. Did you have any resistance from developers to embrace TDD?
We did, yes, sir. Yes, because there were a lot of developers that weren't doing TDD previously, and the next click towards laxness from TDD is just plain old doing unit tests. And so we had a lot of developers that did unit tests, but the whole idea of writing them before you write your code was pretty foreign to a lot of folks.
Right.
And in fact, when we first kicked the project off, we started out without a very great commitment to TDD. Okay. These days, we're very committed to it, and so the result is improved quality. One of the results of it.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Lesson 7, at all levels, currents push us back towards waterfall. You're going to hear people, as they start to do Agile, at the same time that they're experiencing great things from Agile, they're going to have their complaints. There's still going to be some issues. They're going to say, we need more documentation. The current level of lean documentation that we're producing is not enough. You're going to hear developers saying, hey, this is great. Thank you for allowing me to think for myself, but can you do a little more thinking for me? You'll hear developers and QA testers say that sort of thing. You'll hear some customers are going to want more documentation out of what you're producing. You're also going to hear, hey, we need more time up front to figure this stuff out before we just charge into it. Because certainly when you just charge into it, sometimes the team makes bad decisions. And of course, when you're doing a retrospective and looking back, one of the things you say is, if we didn't just charge into this, if we'd figured some of this out up front, then we wouldn't have made that mistake. Remember the old waterfall saying that a little bit of design can reduce a lot of programming, bug fixing, or something along those lines? So you're going to hear people asking for these things. More time for regression testing. We need more time at the end of the sprint. And then you're going to see more email, IM, and bug record correspondence too, as people talk to each other face-to-face less and less often. All these things, if they start becoming really strong, are going to push you right back towards doing waterfall. You're going to end up with this funny form of Scrum butt that involves basically having these, quote, iterations, but iterations really consist of all the different phases of waterfall development. And so you have to be mindful of that. And for some of these things, you have to resist. For some of them, you've got to feed them a little bit. For example, when you hear from a developer that they need more documentation, you've got to ask the question, well, do they really need more documentation, and you've got to talk it over with them. Okay, this is part of the reason why it never ends. The process never stops changing. Lesson number 8, even the best and brightest have trouble with collaboration. So when you talk about Scrum or Agile development in general, and you're talking about people collaborating, breaking down those silo walls, it's a very exciting topic. It's really the way everybody wants to do things. These days, developers have to be social, whereas in the old days, it was acceptable for developers to be the kind of people that just want to be tucked away in the basement office, just churning out some code every now and then. So it's a very exciting idea to imagine everyone collaborating, the idea of community, a development community. The truth is, it's really hard to get even your best folks sometimes to collaborate on things. Some of the same issues remain. Like, for example, if I give a developer a piece of, a library, and I say, hey, let's use this instead of reinventing the wheel, the developer's going to have to fight a little bit of urge to rewrite that library, to just write the code themselves rather than learn what's already in place. And you're going to have similar issues with other groups of folks. Getting them to talk to each other and to collaborate, mostly it's because I think they're very busy and they're staying focused on what their specific job title entails. Okay, but you got to get them to collaborate. They've got to talk. You've got to do all that you can to get them to talk to each other. But it's hard to do that. That's just lesson number 8 that we learned, even though it's a required skill. Lesson number 9, the team will gladly turn in slackers. This is one thing that really, this is almost like one of those seeing the pyramids things for me too. I was amazed at how previously, if you had a developer that wasn't pulling their weight on the team would just sort of tolerate them. However, once we switched over to Agile development and you started having these deadlines, basically the end of a sprint, the day on which you're going to have your demo, the team is glad to say, guess what? Larry here, the developer, is not pulling his weight. He never comes to work. He's never, he starts working on something, but then, these other guys have to finish his work for him. You'd be amazed at how the team is glad to turn in those folks to you and to say, hey, can you do us a favor and get him off of our team? So anyway, it's a help. It's an aid when you're a manager. It means you don't have to go around micromanaging people because the team is glad to turn in those folks that are not pulling their weight.
Tim, can we take a quick question on this topic?
Sure.
Just co-location of teams. So do you have co-located spaces for your teams to allow this visibility of slackers and so on? Or how does co-location fit with your...
Great question. We do have little days of cubicles. However, at the same time, we allow our developers to work 3 days a week from home. So just using simple collaboration tools like Link, for example, Microsoft Link, to detect someone's presence, and you're going to detect their presence when you send them an IM and you get a response or don't get a response, or when you call them and get a response or don't get a response. We found, that's another one of those lessons that we learned that's not even in this presentation, is that you don't have to have everybody in the same little cube area for everything to work properly. We do recommend that they're on the same continent, the same time zone on a given team, but you don't have to have everybody sitting right next to each other. If you look at the layout of our offices, you'll see that we have these little bays, sprint team 1, and you'll have a group of cubicles. We had great expectations in mind for that scheme. We thought, hey, having everybody sitting right close to each other is really going to do a lot to spur on collaboration. We found it really didn't help that much. What really helped was giving them collaboration tools like Link, for example, and enforcing on them that we expect them to be talking to each other often. If they come to you and say, hey, I haven't figured this out, and the answer lies with another developer, you just ask the question, have you spoken to him about it yet? And in time, that just becomes the norm, and people just start going to those other people and expecting them to be available. I probably gave more information than you needed for the answer to that question.
I think this is good. This is very good. Let's keep going. I know you got a number of lessons.
Okay, great. Yeah, we still have a bunch to get through. I'll go quickly. I'll speed it up a little bit. Lean documentation is still good. That documentation is still necessary. A lot of teams think, hey, once I make the jump over to Agile development, we're going to stop producing documentation. And some people even have fear about that. But documentation is still necessary. You just have to figure out the amount of documentation that is necessary. You know how it is. Too much documentation and it becomes obsolete quickly, or it's just plain wrong, or it costs a lot of money to maintain. So you want to find that nice balance between documentation that's useful while not at the same time being too expensive to maintain and to keep up to date. Lesson 11, nothing is over. Nothing. This is a quote from John Rambo. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, your approach is always going to evolve. As you do a sprint and then give the team the opportunity to have retrospective and then process what falls out of the retrospective and make modifications, that's going to continue as far as we can tell until the end of time. Because we've been doing Agile for 10 years now and we're continuing to make tweaks. The team lesson number 12, the team needs to understand that you can't do everything that falls out of retrospectives. When we first started doing retrospectives in earnest, one of the pieces of feedback we got from our staff members was that, hey, you know, I said we need to do this in our retrospectives. Nobody appears to be moving to get that done. Well, if you're a manager, you're on the line, you know that you can't implement everything that everybody wants to do. So we recommend that you tell folks right from the beginning, these retrospectives are for the purpose of helping us improve the way the team is doing things. However, you can't expect that we're going to be able to do all of them. So please have that level of maturity, folks. You're going to have to tell them that, or else they're going to be unhappy. Lesson number 13, although it's not ideal, team members can be Scrum Masters. It is possible. You hear debates sometimes that you have to have dedicated Scrum Masters for the team, and then you hear sometimes that you're just going to end up with a mess if individual team members are Scrum Masters. We found that's not the case at PDX. It is possible for a person to make maybe 50% of their time to allocate it towards the duties of a Scrum Master. It is certainly better when you've got individuals whose only job it is to be the Scrum Master. They can just have more time available to do the things that a Scrum Master is supposed to do. But sometimes you have the budget to do it, and it is good, it's useful, it can be, to have individual team members do it sometimes. In fact, we sometimes rotate that position among team members. It gives the team members another perspective on things. Lesson number 14, you can get executive, managerial, and customer buy-in with your first demo and training on user stories. That's the key. Having a demo and having the demo be more than just a mock-up has great effects. It really builds a lot of confidence with your customers and with the rest of the folks within your organization that you're really getting something done. And what I mentioned, when we started working on EPS, for the first several months, our project looked like a bunch of parts on the garage floor. We couldn't really demonstrate a whole lot. And what we could demonstrate was just a mock-up. But once we started going Agile, we started out with something we could demonstrate nicely. Every button worked. Nothing was stuck out. And then the amount of functionality available just increasingly became more available. We started having more and more functionality done. So having those demos, it does a lot to get them not only to have confidence, but then to buy in, to say, hey, these guys are really going to get the job done. We've got to give them the support that they need to get it done. Lesson number 15, having customers and other stakeholders at demos is a good thing. One of the whole points of Agile is that at the end of an iteration, you've got somebody verifying for you that you're hitting the mark, that you're not producing something that they didn't ask for. And so having them at demos is a good thing. Now, I've seen some organizations that say, oh, there's no way we can get our executives to show up for these things. No way we can get our customers to show up. They're just too busy, or they don't think this is important. I recommend that you go back at them again. You do all that you can to get them to show up for these things, because it will save a lot in the long run. It'll also incrementally introduce them to the product, and they'll start getting more and more excited about it as they see more and more functionality become available. Lesson number 16, let the Scrum team stay focused. Retain a production support team. One thing that we found early on is kind of a textbook problem with Agile development shops in a lot of cases. And that's that, the whole point of Scrum is that you've got lots of folks concentrated on solving a problem. But what happens in reality is, hey, this one system is down. We need Larry to stop what he's doing and to come over and help us get it up and going again. Oh, that can have a bad effect on the team meeting their deadline. So what we do at PDX, and we're not the only team to do this, but we have a production support team, a group of developers whose job it is basically to keep the production up and going. If there's a problem that requires a developer's expertise, the support folks at our company draw upon those people. And those people are also churning out bug fixes that are critical if they find any in production. That enables the Scrum team to stay focused on what they're doing. And you can rotate membership on that production support team. One thing that really has been amazing to me is that some folks you're going to find actually enjoy being on that production support team. You know, from a high level, when you hear the words production support, that just sounds like the anti-glamour organization. But really, there are folks that enjoy the heck out of working on those teams because there's always a lot of action. Lesson number 17, get your DBA team to agree to an SLA. Oftentimes, DBA teams are kind of left out of the equation when you're talking about how does Agile work. And oftentimes it's because the DBA team is busy keeping databases up and going. And they usually have their own waterfall-like process for churning out column changes, table changes, schema changes in general for your databases. One thing that I recommend that you do is you draw your DBA team into this whole thing and make sure that they are abiding by SLAs. You don't want developers to say, well, we need this new column to implement this new functionality, but we've got to wait 6 weeks for a DBA to be able to make the changes, the schemas. You don't want that kind of thing. There's some organizations where developers actually make the schema changes. We're not one of those shops, and I know there are a lot of companies out there that are not like that as well. Lesson number 18, break down those user stories. Sometimes user stories turn into very big affairs. It can be they're very general, and they can really encapsulate a whole new module in a system, let alone one or two operations that are necessary. So what you do is you basically just break down the user stories. If a user story has a lot of story points associated with it, then you can say, hey, that needs breaking down, and turn it into something that's a lot more digestible. Lesson number 19, keep noise managers, executives out of kickoffs. How can I say this? Someone told me, and then other people confirmed it, that Jim Smith needed to stay out of kickoff meetings. And it's because I just happen to be naturally the kind of guy that likes to just tell people what to do, or to call baloney on people, say that shouldn't be so hard, or hey, we've got to have this by this day. Well, it's a bad practice to have guys like Jim Smith in kickoff meetings being allowed to talk a whole lot. So one good idea is to just keep those really noisy people out of the kickoff meetings. There's still a way to get their input, but it's certainly not to expose them to the team and for the team to start feeling the pressure of those folks. Ideally, your team members would push back on noisy executives and managers, but if the noisy executive has a title of senior vice president this or that, or director of this thing or that thing, then a lot of them, just by nature, turns out that a lot of development folks are not confrontational. They don't want to stand up to a noisy executive to tell them that, hey, I'm sorry, I disagree with you on that. Oftentimes they'll just say, oh, well, he's telling us we have to do it. So if you like your product, want it to be good, then you should keep those noisy guys out of the room. Lesson number 20, the stand-up is for everybody, not just for the Scrum Master or for a project manager to express what's on their mind or to get what the team is doing. The team ought to be listening to each other. So if Larry, the developer, for example, talks about what he worked on yesterday, if Mo, the developer, if a flag goes up for him, then he should know it, and then after the meeting they should talk about it. They should go offline. So you've got to be careful because daily meetings sometimes devolve into these ugly things where everybody's just standing there kind of giving their status, and there's not really any kind of discussion that happens afterwards. When really the purpose of that thing is so that everyone can communicate with everyone else. It's a way to ensure that at least for 15 minutes every day, the team is gathering and talking to each other. So you've got to make the most out of it. Don't let it devolve into just a status spewing session. Lesson 21, the product owner has to appreciate the value of paying technical debt. Usually product owners are folks that understand the business, and that's good. They ought to understand the business. But they also need to understand the importance of paying technical debt. I sometimes hear people talking about that being a challenge that's just insurmountable, and I have to call baloney on that one. Because if someone is bright enough, business-wise, to be a product owner, they are certainly capable. They have the intellectual capacity to understand the importance of paying technical debt. If, for example, you're on version 1.4 of Java, and the product owner doesn't have an appreciation for the dangers of being on that ancient version of Java, then you've got a bad product owner on your hands. Okay? And it is possible for the team to say, hey, look, you need to understand why it's important to pay this technical debt. You could have security problems, high-profile security problems that are going to do bad things to your product and to your customers, just as an example. Hey, Hammond, I think we just hit the 1240. Yeah, we did hit 1245. I'm only on lesson number 22. Shall I continue just plowing ahead?
Yeah, continue, but just pick up pace, Jim. I think there's a lot of value in these lessons, so we'll squeeze a Q&A time. We ask some questions along the way, but just pick up paces only.
Okay, great. I'll try and move faster. So the product owner is not the team owner, lesson number 22. In time, the product owner, because they've got so much on their mind, they've got so much input, specifically they've got so much pressure coming from customers, executives, and so many other, from third-party vendors, that they oftentimes take it out on the team. And they say, hey, you are going to do this, and you're going to like it, or you're going to do that. That's generally a bad scene. You want the product owner to be dictating the priority of user stories, but you don't want them necessarily to be bossing around the individual team members. I could go on and on about that, but I'm going to jump to number 23. People talking to each other, people slamming doors. By slamming doors, I don't mean literally slamming doors. I mean they're just not helping each other out, or they're putting up walls. Then you've got a dysfunctional Agile team, and you need to address the problem, or else you're not going to get continually better. Lesson 24, parties and other rewards after demos equals good. I'm going to stop for a moment on this one and say this is really an important one. A lot of development managers don't have an appreciation for the importance of this one. A lot of development managers got to where they are by working hard, and work is just in itself something that they think is worth doing, and they don't even need a reward in a lot of cases. You've got to keep in mind, however, that your foot soldiers can appreciate some type of reward. So if you had a good demo, take the team out, come out to lunch, take them, have a happy hour event, take them bowling, do something fun with them, do something to just make a big deal out of the fact that they just succeeded. Because they want it and they deserve it too. They're the ones that are working really hard getting the job done, and you owe it to them to give them some recognition. It's less about the free lunch, the taste of the free lunch, or the satisfied feeling of stuffing themselves, and more about the recognition. You've got to make sure you're giving that, and it's a very easy thing for most development managers to neglect. Don't neglect it. It's an easy win. Just do it. Lesson 25. Don't let a sprint go longer than 5 weeks. If it goes longer than 5 weeks, then basically you're going to wear the team out. But I'm going to rush ahead a little bit. Lesson 26, train your developers to sign off on user stories early. Some developers want to wait until the very last day, until QA has found no more problems with the software before they say, okay, I'm going to sign off on this. And the bad effect that's going to have is it's going to make your burn down charts look ugly. And you're not really going to be sure how far along when someone says, how's that sprint doing? Okay, so train them to sign off on user stories early. The product owner position is a full-time job. This is an important one, lesson number 27. Some organizations, when they adopt Agile, they're out there looking for a product owner, and they think, hey, let's get the vice president of sales to do this job. In my experience, that never works. We have not really done that sort of thing in PDX, thankfully, much. We did it a little bit, but I've seen other organizations doing it, and then saying in the end, our product owner really doesn't exist because he's out on the road all the time, or he doesn't even maintain a backlog, really. He has no idea what we're working on. You really have to get someone to be, your choice of product owner really ought to be someone that's dedicated to the cause, not someone that has another full-time job. Lesson number 28, we already talked about this one, so I'm not going to talk about it much now, but co-location is good, but it's not absolutely necessary. Lesson 29, your development and test environments are production environments. You got to make sure that they stay up. This one is kind of independent of Agile, But I noticed that when you start doing agile development, if a development environment is down, it really, really gets a lot of people, introduces a lot of anxiety. You just imagine you're a developer and you committed to getting the job done by a certain date, and then all of a sudden your system is down. You can't do any development. That's a bad thing. You've got to make sure that your IT team understands that you've got commitments to fulfill, and they too have to be agile and get your systems fixed right away. You want to make the investment in your systems too, to give them all the redundancy that they need to be able to stay up, because it'll be worth it. If you just think in terms of developers being down with nothing to do or having to find something not of questionable usefulness to do when their systems are down, then you can imagine the great waste involved. Lesson 30. We're on the home stretch here. Don't treat your India folks like warm bodies, or they'll act like warm bodies. Before we put our current India team in place, before we built a team in India, using Synerzip, by the way, before that we had 2 attempts at India outsourcing, and they didn't work very well. I could talk easily a few days about this on this topic, but I'll just say, if you think that when you've got an agile team, that your India team is just going to be a black box, basically a bunch of nameless folks churning out code, then you're setting yourself up for failure. A fundamental part of agile development is that your team members are plugged into each other. They're talking to each other. So a part of that has to be that your India team, or your offshore team, wherever they happen to be, offshore or onshore team, nearshore team, that you're plugged into them. You know their names. You know their faces, you know a few things more about them, and that you're not just considering them to be a black box churning out code. But anyway, if you do that, then they're going to act like a bunch of warm bodies, and you'll have lots of turnover, and they won't get the job done for you the way you want it done. So right from the start, never think of that India team or your offshore or nearshore team as being just a black box. Lesson 31, sashimi is a great idea, but not always 100% possible. For those of you that don't know what the sashimi thing is, it's the concept that you divide your work vertically. In the old world, you had developers that were UI developers and back-end developers and middleware developers, and each worked on their particular layer. Well, the agile way is to divide your work vertically. And so if you've got a new piece of functionality, then the same developer might work on the user interface, the back end, and the middleware, and so on. They'll do all of it, and they'll get the job done. One thing you just have to face, though, something you learned, is that it's not always 100% possible, because sometimes you got developers that are junior level, and they're not capable out of the box at working on all layers associated with your stack. So that's a lesson we learned. But you should strive for it as much as possible. It'll make your life easier in the end. Lesson 32, velocity steadily increases when your team rosters are constant and working on the same products. So if you often change your team rosters, then you're not going to get up really enough momentum for your velocity to increase steadily. So that's it. We're almost in here. Lesson 33, the product ought to be ready for production after every sprint. Even though it's not always possible, you should try and make it happen for every sprint. If you're finishing up a sprint and some of your code is just your user interface is just mocked up, or parts of your code just plain don't work if you take it off-road and it starts throwing all kinds of exceptions and errors, then you're not really getting the job done, and you're basically just leaving a lot of loose ends for future cleanup sprints. So if you start surrendering to that early, if you start early on accepting that it's okay for your code to not be production ready when you're done with a sprint, you're going to end up with a big ugly ball of broken code at the end. So you want to make sure that at the end of every sprint it is production ready, or at least as close as possible to be production ready. The Scrum Master is a strong servant leader. He's not George Patton. He's a guy that basically is just saying, okay, the team needs to get the job done, and I'm going to get rid of the whatever impediments they identify to them getting the job done, and that's what I'm going to do. If your Scrum Masters are out there running the show instead, that's a bad sign. Lesson number 35, plaster the product backlog everywhere. just to keep everyone on the same page at all levels. Make sure your company brass knows it, knows where they can find it. Make sure that your customers know it. Get it out there so that, because the danger of everyone not knowing about your backlog is that you might end up working on something that's not that important, or you might fail to work on something that's critical that has to get done right away. When you're plastering it everywhere, putting it on web pages, putting it up on the wall, forcing it down people's throats in meetings where you review the backlog and so on, sending it through email messages to people, then you're going to keep everyone on the same page. But it does require a lot of work. You can't expect, for example, for an executive, a CEO, let's say, to log into Rally and to see what your work, the top item is on a given product's backlog. You've got to take it to them and say, how's this look? There are lots of techniques for doing that, but I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to finish here. Developers are professionals. They're not privates in the Army. Treat them as such. So developers, whether they're programmers, QA testers, designers, DBAs, architects, they all have some education, and they all work hard to perfect their craft. And you cannot treat them just as you would treat a private in the Army, let's say. You got to treat them as professionals. You got to respect the work that they do, and you got to keep feeding them good stuff, including a constant supply of continuing education. And you got to respect what they say to you. If you try and downgrade them to privates in the Army, then they're going to behave like privates in the Army, and they're going to do exactly what you tell them. And when you do that sort of thing, you are forfeiting, for every developer for whom you do that, you're forfeiting the power of their brain. It's a bad thing to do. And this is the last one, lesson number 37. Scrum is not an acronym. Don't capitalize it. Don't put little dots after each letter in it. It refers to that very ugly, sorry, I'm being subjective here, but that ugly formation in rugby where everybody is concentrating on the same goal at the same time. So that's it. Are there any questions? Do we have any time for questions?
Yeah, so I'll still try to squeeze a couple questions. If we can just advance to the next couple pages. We already have a bunch of questions. Let me do a quick overview of Synerzip just in 30 seconds, if we can get to the next page, Jim. So for all the audience, people in the audience who don't know Synerzip, we are a software product development partner of companies like PDX in this case. We help clients adopt Agile and then do good ongoing Agile development work with dedicated teams for each client, just like the story you heard with PDX. So let us know if we can help. Let's move to really following some content and questions. So one question, Jim, that came up, which is a good one to consider, is you talked about how much not to do upfront. Can you talk about how much architecture and software design to do upfront is a part of good Agile practice?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's subjective, and it's something that I think we constantly adjust to. And in fact, PDX has adjusted several times. I'll just give you an example of one little snapshot in time, because no particular scheme is, basically addresses every situation. So I'll just tell you, like at one point, basically the way PDX was doing it was we would have a pre-planning period of about 2 weeks before a series of 3 sprints. So that was an opportunity about quarterly or so for everybody to get together. We would bring in all kinds of folks into this meeting that would last for about 2 weeks to review all of the stuff that was coming up. Architects would get the opportunity to lay out the architecture. DBAs would get the opportunity to lay out the database, and the design team had the opportunity to design the user interface and so on. And then they would jump into each individual sprint. They jump into the first sprint. And tweaks were possible between the first, second, and third sprints, but usually you would, in the end, have only slight tweaks in sprint 2 or sprint 3 after that initial pre-planning. Okay, but we've modified that quite a bit throughout our history. There's no right answer, I think.
Let's take one final question, metrics. What metrics you guys follow now that you're well along the Agile adoption journey, and how are those metrics different than what you had before you started in Agile?
So a lot of our metrics are based around user stories and story points. You have to be careful when it comes to story points. Story points are like they're kind of like currency. Just because one team is assigning a higher number of story points to a given piece of functionality than another team doesn't mean that it's necessarily significantly more work or even more work at all necessarily. But within a team, those metrics can become useful. One great example of, and there are lots of different kinds of metrics. There are quality metrics, there are velocity metrics, and so on. But a great example of a quality metric is the number of defects per story point. So you always want to have great velocity for a team, and you want great quality. And a lot of folks argue, and there's truth in this. Attention to one means, a lot of attention to one means basically neglecting another. So in other words, if you start putting a lot of effort into getting velocity, then your quality might start to suffer. So one way that we found to balance that is to use, basically the number of defects per story point. That's a good way, we think. But again, it's only meaningful per team. I will say one other thing really quickly. This is a lot of this is well known in the Agile community, but a lot of folks adopting Agile don't get it. You really have to be careful about using story points to gauge velocity. It's really hard to measure the velocity of a team and to basically hold them accountable for maintaining a velocity. To say, hey, you normally get 20 story points done per sprint. We're going to hold you to that every sprint. You can just think through it and imagine some of the pain you could introduce by doing that kind of thing. Developers are just going to start modifying the number of story points that they assign.
Right.
Very difficult to do that. It's also very difficult to measure velocity performance per team member. It's easier to do it per team. And again, that's a pretty well-known one within the Agile community, but a lot of development managers either don't know it or they ignore it, and they pursue that one anyway.
I guess metrics is a topic that could be a webinar topic by itself.
It could, yes, sir. I've attended many of those, for the record. You'll see them on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for sharing. I know there are many more questions. I encourage people who attended the session today, if there are any of these questions you would like to follow up, let me know. We'll figure out a way to do it. And thank you all for attending, and thanks again, Jim, for being there to go over these lessons. You were